You're listening to Ember Weekend, your weekend recap of all things Ember. This is episode 56. I'm Chase McCarthy.
And I'm Jonathan Jackson, and we're here to keep you in the Ember Run Loop. We're broadcasting from HashRocket HQ, and this week's episode is called Did Insert Episode Title. So this past week, Lauren Tan wrote a couple of blog posts, actually, one on Dockyard and one on her personal blog, Emberway. The first one is about Ember Composable helper, and if you're a longtime listener of the show, you probably remember in episode 54. I mean, this was 2 or 3 weeks ago. We talked a lot about composable helpers. I think that's one of her main add-ons, like her main avenues of work at the moment. So it's obviously a big deal. And in this blog post, she kind of explores some of the responsibilities of templates and kind of how they should be used, and then when you might want to use something like composable helpers, and really kind of dives into not just Ember composable helpers, but helpers in general, and when they're useful and how they're useful. A couple of the things that I thought were really interesting were kind of neatly describing some of the terms that we frequently use to describe templates, but don't really ever think about too much. So a lot of times in past episodes, I've talked to Chase about templates should be declarative, and I don't think we ever really talk about what that means. And it's kind of that it should just, like, the template should communicate its own intent. And there's a couple of sections in this blog post that really explore that concept, saying, hey, you need to communicate the intent, but you need to communicate it clearly. So one of the things that continually came up, I think Phil Gengler had a thing on this at Ember NYC, was saying, like, at a certain point in time, this can really fall apart, and you want to really abstract into computed properties into your context. But and I think the example she gives here is a really deeply nested Lispy looking series of and or conditionals. So if, and then paren or, and then two conditions with an and. I mean, it can get out of hand. But that's declarative, but it's not really communicating the intent very clearly. So it's still, all of the information is there, but it's not succinct enough to be grokkable. So I think it's really important that, when you talk about declarative templates, we make the caveat that it needs to communicate the intent clearly. So that as soon as it doesn't do that clearly, you really need to pull out CPs. And that clearly, when I say clearly, I'm kind of doing air quotes here, because that clearly is something that is left up to you to decide. So at a certain point in time, you have to use your best judgment. And that's why when we were talking to Lauren in the interview, we mentioned a few times that it takes a little bit of discipline, and the level of the developer kind of affects the style that your templates will follow. Because for some people, this will seem very natural, and some people it will feel not. So you have to use your best judgment. So I thought that was really, really interesting, and this blog post kind of explores a lot of those concepts. And then there were a couple of really good quotes here. One from Kathy Siracusa, who had an amazing blog post that we're probably going to talk about in a future episode. But one of the closing quotes that Lauren said, and she said this on our interview episode as well, was basically, just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should. So once again, kind of talking about drawing that line on where you need to go. You really need to, exercise some judgment. So
That reminds me of the Eric Brin quote from training. With great power comes great responsibility to not do ridiculous shit.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah. Just that's such a succinct way.
Right. It sounds like it's going to be like this really good, nice, sincere quote, from Peter Parker.
Just not do ridiculous shit.
Yeah. Just don't do ridiculous shit.
Yeah, so this kind of segues neatly into Lauren's other post this past week on the Emberway blog about closure actions. Chase, do you want to talk about some closure actions?
I really love this add-on. This was RWJ Blue had created a JS bin for this, and then him and Lauren made this into an add-on, and it's pretty awesome. And this blog post actually helped me understand a little bit about how it works. And, made me kind of like want to dig into the source code a little bit, which I did. And that was, it's pretty simple, but, there's some, cool stuff kind of going on. And this kind of talks about that. And then the reasoning behind it too, which is great, because, I never really thought about the fact that when you triggered an action from some template somewhere and you said action foo, that foo could actually happen like, one of 3 different types of things anywhere up the line, so you could, it could be in the component that you're in right now. It could be in the controller that's, running all of those components. It could be in the route for that. So, and it can be in routes up the chain, so it's pretty confusing. So the only case you have now, and this is coming from, kind of looking at the source, that it's going to happen in a route. And that's like what this really gives you, is that, you can eliminate two different types of things and say, I know this happens in the route. The one thing that this does seem to do from looking at the source code is that it will get the most deeply nested one first. So if you had like 3 routes and they all had an action called foo, you would get the one closest to you. You get the lowest level route. And that's, that seems normal. It's basically just action bubbling. So, it's works as expected, but it's really powerful. I really like this, and
So you're saying that it will get, so if I have foo bar baz as a set of routes, of nested routes, if I define an action called print something, and I define that in all 3 of those foo bar baz routes, it's going to get the baz route and run its print something action.
Yeah, if baz is the lowest level one.
Okay, but if baz didn't define print something, but bar did, it would execute that action.
Right.
Okay, so it would go up the chain looking for it, but as soon as it finds one, it's going to use whatever the lowest one is.
Yeah, that's what it seems like.
Cool.
And, and the other cool thing about these actions are you actually get to deal with the return value. Because they're closure actions. And so that's, pretty powerful too. Like we've done this before where we, you might want to get a promise back and then like wait on the response of like, some query to an API or something and say, there's a validation message. I need to not, close this page. So yeah, it's a really useful add-on. We've used it a few times now, and every time I'm just like thankful that it's there. It's not rolled into core or anything. This is one of the things you have to have an add-on for, and so she mentions is that it is kind of painful right now. Ember's in this kind of transition period where actions are changing, but I think the ability for an add-on to have this this kind of fundamental change on the framework, but still feel very Ember-y, kind of speaks a lot to Ember's power.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I really like the philosophy of Ember's core as it's switching. I think a lot of questions are asked like, oh, hey, what if we could do this? And instead of adding it to core, you create an add-on, and there's enough flexibility there to where you can actually test these ideas out and see how they work and how they mesh, and it doesn't have to get in the way of the core changes, or like it doesn't have to pollute core work while during that exploration phase. So it's pretty cool. I definitely love seeing add-ons like this.
Yeah, definitely. So throughout EmberConf, John and I were working on updating the Ember Weekend site to use JSON API.
Still not done.
Don't mention that. So we were working on getting this update to use JSON API with an Elixir backend, which is all ready. Actually, there's only a couple minor things that are keeping us from launching this, which hopefully we'll get that soon. But while we were mentioning to many people that we were converting over to JSON API, and one of the people that was really interested in that conversion was Adolfo Builas, who was writing a JSON API book. And so we recently got a hold of copies of this. It's a very good basic intro to JSON API, along with a decent beginner's guide to just how to use Rails as an API.
Yeah, and the really important thing to note here is that JSON API, while it is a very verbose spec, and the spec has a lot of information, there are still a lot of questions that are unanswered, even in the spec. So I don't know. I think we were talking about loading associated records, and there's a way to do that with links. And like this book has a whole section on how to do that. So the book really it's a relatively fast read. Going through it, you can really get a lot of information about how to utilize JSON API right now. And honestly, there's not a lot of resources there. So this is such a good time for this to come out. And also, I'm really excited because Ember CLI 101 was so good that I just have so much confidence in Adolfo's work. I'm really excited to start busting this one out and really applying a lot of the better practices around our JSON API.
Yeah, and this book goes into some of the more obscure features of JSON API and how that it ties in with like what's new in Rails 5, the -- API. So like one of the things that was really helpful was knowing which status codes get returned for which things. Like if you don't ask for content type JSON API, the API returns a 415 and says, I don't know how to deal with this response. And then, so a lot of the APIs are driven off of status codes. But one of the other things that JSON API allows is application-specific error codes. So you have a status code, which is a normal HTTP status code, but then you also might have independent application error codes that would, work across the browser or your iOS app or whatever. And so this kind of covers the differences between those. There are also different types of error messages. There's like an error title and an error, I think it's a detail, and it covers that in great detail. And then this goes on to build a simple example app that basically has a very simple model of friends that you're loaning an article to. So there is a kind of a structure that kind of exercises each piece of JSON API and then shows how to build that.
Yeah. I'm really excited. Like I said, running into the JSON API things, learning how to deal with associations and create relatively complex object graphs. A lot of the documentation is there. It's just hard to understand. It took me quite a while to kind of get some of the edge cases in my head. So this book is definitely going to be something that if I were starting to work on a JSON API app, I would pick up and start looking over, because I'm sure it will save countless hours of your time. Just trying to load all this information in your head.
Yeah, definitely. And just keep in mind with JSON API, it's kind of an evolving spec. It is at 1.0, but it's not like that 1.0 solved every possible case. So there are things that like other, types of, I don't know, you'd call that API structures. Like what is like a SOAP or something, or
right.
some types of APIs have certain features that JSON API didn't roll in. And that's most likely because, if you try to standardize on a bad set of features, then it's going to be terrible for the actual specification. So it's kind of like right now it is the Wild West when you start getting into more complicated things. But I'm sure the best solutions will float to the top.
So earlier this month, shortly after EmberConf, Heroku released an interview that Terrence Lee and Matthew Krieger did with Tom Dale, discussing a lot of different things, discussing where Ember sits inside of web development in general, the space, as compared to, say, mobile development or native app development, rather. And it really is caught between kind of mobile devs and traditional webs. And one of the quotes here was, you're caught in the crossfire. No matter what you do, someone's going to criticize you. You either have too much JavaScript or you don't have enough features. So discussing like how to put Ember in a really good spot to be like EmberConf's keynote was saying, as an SDK for the web. And they talk about all this stuff. It's actually really cool. So you can listen to it, and as you're listening to it, it's also transcribed. Yeah, that's the word. On the right hand side, so you can actually read along, which is, I think, pretty great. We've been talking about trying to do that for Ember Weekend for quite some time, and I think it's a really cool thing. Some of the other things that were discussed in this were Fastboot, talking about how it's noticeably faster on slower networks. So on a normal broadband internet connection with on your desktop, it's going to be a fast boot versus non-fast boot app is going to be pretty much the same. But as soon as you start dipping down the slower to a slower network, so 2G or 3G, you see some pretty great performance gains, which is pretty cool. And really thinking and talking about how you need to think about an Ember app when it can run in both Node and in a browser. Because there really is like that is a decision or a discussion that you have to have every time you create a new feature to really decide, like, okay, well, what are the key features here? Can we do these and serve them up via Fastboot? Is it possible to, you have to make a lot of decisions up front. How do we architect this thing such that it will be correct for people who are connecting for the first time? So it's really interesting. I really enjoyed that aspect of the discussion. It also talked about Heroku's work on the build pack for kind of doing Fastboot easily in Heroku, which we actually were dabbling with this a little while ago, and it was exceedingly pleasant. The interactions there were pretty simple, and I the amount of work going into that is pretty tremendous. So I think Terrence Lee is spearheading that, and it's pretty cool. I really like using Heroku and being able to just kind of get fast boot out of the box relatively for free is pretty awesome.
Yeah, and one of the other things that Tom touched on with this was that it sounds weird to say Tom, right? Because like his name is literally like one word. It's Tom Dale.
You're cool. You're good. You got it, man. Go either way, man. Tom Dale, Tom. It's cool. We're all
Dale,
friends here.
TDL. So one of the other things that Tom Dale actually mentioned with this is a lot of work that's going into trying to get app cache for free, and that seems really interesting. Like it's something that would be really nice to have, and I've worked with apps that we had to do a lot of work in order to get the manifest right and then get everything working. And I'm sure there's a ton of work when you try to roll that in with Fastboot, because now you're getting different versions of the index HTML back depending on the state that gets rendered from Fastboot. So, but hopefully in the not too distant future we'll have ridiculously fast apps that are completely cached. He was mentioning something like everyone should have sub 200 millisecond second reloads, and so that'll be really nice.
Yeah, it's very cool. It's definitely worth a listen to. I know it's a little bit out of date. I think interview weeks plus straight off of EmberConf, we ended up missing some things in early April. So maybe this is old news, but I really enjoyed this interview, and I think it's worth your time.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for listening to Ember Weekend. If you'd like to follow along, visit us at emberweekend.com.
Or you can find us at Ember Weekend, all one word, on Twitter, or subscribe via RSS.
I'm Chase McCarthy.
And I'm Jonathan Jackson.
And we'll see you next weekend.